Impact frames. Chances are you've probably seen one before, but chances are also that you probably didn't notice. Or more likely you did, but you aren't going to go back and watch that 10-second segment at a slower speed, because ain't nobody got time for that. Impact frames are everywhere. You basically can't watch any form of animation without finding at least one of these suckers. I have no clue if that's true, but anyways, most everyone can agree that impact frames are pretty darn cool. So cool, in fact, I'm gonna add some to my own animation. This is stupid, I'm never doing this crap again. Yeah, like all other forms of art, you can't just pick up an Apple Pencil and start impact framing. Or maybe you can, and to that I say, you've been blessed, do not squander your gift. For the rest of us, we've gotta actually learn how to make these things. Question is, where the frickety frick do I even start? Well, fear not, for I am here to give you the knowledge you need to become the best impact framer in history. Warning, you will not actually be the best impact framer in history. I am not a professional or anywhere close to an expert on this subject. These are simply tips that I use and help me greatly. Side effects may include hepatitis B, sudden outbursts in Swahili, death and dismemberment, dysentery. Before we get started, we should figure out, the heck even is an impact frame? Well, these are abstract frames of an animation that help to sell the impact of an action.
Say that again?
These are usually, but not always, black and white frames that focus more on abstract concepts and shapes rather than details. They can come in all different shapes and sizes, but are best used in shorter bursts. Now, there's one thing you need to know when making an impact frame, and this is legitimately, I would say, more important than actually being able to draw a single impact frame. Before you even think about adding a frame, you need to know where to put them. Without direction, your animation might end up looking sloppily put together, to say the least. Impact frames are to be treated like spices. You can't blow out the flavor of your dish by layering it in spices, and you need to have a decent foundation. Otherwise, you're simply spicing up literal doo-doo water. You can have the best impact frames in the game, but if you just throw them everywhere, it'll end up being all style and no substance. You won't have good writing, you'll just have hype moments and aura. Which isn't even that bad. Honestly, that's a bad comparison in this context. Basically, just don't throw random impact frames at the wall and hope it sticks. So, where should impact frames go? Well, it depends on the type of impact frame, but most of them should be directly before a really big hit. If you aren't planning for the impact to be super heavy, or one you really want to feel, probably hold off on the impact frames. A great rule of thumb is, how much do I want the watcher to feel this next action? From there, you can pretty well gauge what kind of frame to use. Speaking of what kind of frames to use... Alright, so for our examples, I've got these two stickman animations of a guy throwing a haymaker and one of him charging up. If you watch them, they don't look bad per se, but the impact isn't really there. But I don't know how to make impact frames. Well, worry not, because I have the solution for you. Now, this technique I'm about to show you is quite complicated, and takes years upon years to master, so don't worry if you don't get it the first try. Alright, now pay attention, here's what you're supposed to do. Yeah, impact frames don't have to be anything special, you can legit just have a white frame and call it a day. Now, this technique isn't perfect. Far, far from it, in fact. First, this type of impact frame is typically best for a smaller impact, or for a short burst of energy. Second, if you have more than about 4 frames, the illusion breaks a little bit. Here's how I suggest going about this type of impact frame. First, is this a really big attack you want to emphasize? If so, maybe don't use this type of frame. However, if it's more of a simple attack, or a type of transitional attack, then I suggest using this pattern. White, black, red. White and black are basic impact frame colors, and white should be first, because going with the bright color first really helps sell the impact more.
Say that again?
As for red, that color is usually associated with so I suggest it for attacks. Now for energy bursts, I suggest replacing the red with whatever color the energy is. And with that, you've got simple impact frames, and you don't even need to spend weeks trying and failing to make them look halfway decent. But let's be real, you aren't here for basic colors. You're here to learn how to do this, or this, or this. You get the black and white pictures. Alright, first things first. Here are the basics of making these kinds of frames. First, always animate in ones. If you aren't aware, most animations are made in 24 FPS, or frames per second. Within this parameter, there's a technique of animating in ones, twos, or threes. Animation in ones means you show 1 frame per drawing, the full 24 frames per second. Animating in twos means that you have 2 frames per drawing, so it's kinda like animating in 12 FPS. And animating in threes, you'll never believe this, means you have 3 frames per drawing. None of these techniques are really wrong, but I'm not going to go into too much detail here. Basically, what you need to know is, the entire point of an impact frame is for it to be quick and snappy. And trust me, the more you get the hang of making these things, the less you'll ever want to make them in twos or threes. So always animate your impact frames in ones. Second, have your color pattern decided. You can definitely use other colors in certain situations, however I would just stick with good old black and white to start. I would also advise against ever using more than at most 5 colors in your frames. At that point, you're kinda losing the point of an impact frame. Again, they aren't supposed to have a ton of detail, so keeping it simple is for sure the way to go in this scenario. Just to be clear, I will be using Procreate to make these impact frames, because I have a workflow that would give the average animator an aneurysm, but all of what I say can be applied to most any program, as long as you have brushes that are somewhat like my examples, which I can almost guarantee they will have. For most impact frames, you're going to want to use a pencil-like brush. I, for example, mostly use technical pencil. That way, you get that sort of grainy and rough look to your impact frames that a cleaner brush wouldn't give you. These are more common types of impact frames, probably because the grainy, scratchy pencil look usually heavily contrasts with the otherwise more polished product of the rest of the animation, giving the frames a more impact. The first way you can go about making these frames is by outlining. Basically, you just trace over the line art using the pencil brush. Also, you know that chicken scratch artists will tell you not to do when making a sketch? Guess what rule we're about to break? Now, there's a couple things I want to note about this technique. First, you don't have to keep this in mind, but to add some spice to these frames, you should keep in mind the thickness of your brush. Let's take a look at this frame here. As you can see, the hand has a far thicker outline than the rest of the body, making it the obvious source of attention. Now wait a second before you start doing this to all your outline frames. These tricks should not be used in all your frames. Another helpful rule of thumb is that the frame should get more intense and drastic as it continues. The first frame should be relatively chill, while the last one should show the craziness of the impact. This also applies to how high you draw the parts where the outline rises and dips. The farther into the frames you are, the higher and deeper these should be. Alright, so I realize what I'm saying might not make a whole heck of a lot of sense, so I'm going to do a live example right here, using this picture of Hero Shadow and Awakened Supersonic I made. Specifically Shadow, I'm going to be focusing on Shadow. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull up my technical pencil, and I'm going to lower the opacity right here. So what I mean by this is the first frame of an animation should look more like this. So we're going to outline, we're just going to do the face, we're going to outline completely. We're not going to focus on any of the line thickness right now. Alright, and as you can see there we have a outlined shadow face for a impact frame. And this is what I mean when I say it should have, again, impact frames aren't supposed to have a ton of detail, so even this isn't very detailed, but this is what I mean when I say it should get more drastic, is it should start like this, and then, for the next frame, for one of the last frames, you should do something like this. Only, like, outlining the top of everything, just to kind of show, like, oh, it's getting less detailed and more abstract, which is kind of the goal for these impact frames. And that kind of helps to sell the impact of whatever it is you're trying to show, whether that be a power-up or some sort of really cool, awesome attack. And boom. There we have the last impact frame. So first, last. Next up, we have the exact opposite of the last technique. Looking around, I don't usually see a lot of people using this technique, and I have no idea why. But anyways, with this method, which I call filling, you color in using the pencil brush, filling in anything that is within the lines. Now this one takes a lot longer per frame and is a little less versatile than outlining. Maybe that's why it's not used so often. Anywho, you basically don't have to worry about line thickness, obviously, nor any rises nor divots. I'd say these types of frames are good as a first frame. It's kind of good with the continuously less detailed idea that helps sell the impact even more.
Say that again?
The final way you can go... Oh, was that a voice crack? Yeah, no, that was 100% a voice crack. Oh, thanks, voice. The final way you can go about making an impact frame that I'll talk about in this video is by a method I call blocking. This is actually a really common type of frame in Dragon Ball Z, and I would say is easier to do than the last two methods, but definitely looks a lot simpler. Which may be exactly what it needs to look like. It all depends on the animation. This technique is actually very similar to filling, since this method has you fill in everything within the line art, but this time, instead of using a pencil-like brush, use a normal pen one, and then use the fill tool. There isn't much to say about this specific technique since it's so simple. All I would say is be careful how close you are to the line art, because if you don't block far enough away, it'll look like a big piece of nothingness. But also don't block too far away so that you can tell what the frame is actually supposed to be depicting. And there you have it, 4 great ways to make your impact frames. Granted, there are still plenty of more tips to go over, but I don't want to have an overwhelming amount of info in this video, so if you want to catch part 2 when it drops, consider subscribing. Alright, I suck at outro, so go watch one of these videos, okay, bye!
Miles, the Black One!